Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Deadpool and Wolverine are together at last, in a film that isn't X-Men Origins Wolverine, that is. Wade Wilson, aka Deadpool, played by Ryan Reynolds, is taken from his timeline by Mr. Paradox, played by Matthew McFadden, and offered a place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe of Earth 616. However, Wade learns that his timeline is declining after the death of its anchor being Logan, aka Wolverine, played by Hugh Jackman, and Paradox intends to destroy it. Wade tries to use a variant of Logan from another timeline to save his own, but Paradox sends them both into the void, ruled over by Charles Xavier's twin sister, Cassandra Nova, played by Emma Corrin, and Wade and Logan must begrudgingly team up to escape and save Wade's timeline. It's all come very fittingly full circle, given that Deadpool's first film appearance was in the absolutely abysmal X-Men Origins Wolverine, where the character has done a total disservice by being turned into Weapon 11, a generic bad guy for Wolverine to fight at the end of the movie, the Merc with a mouth infamously being turned into the Merc without a mouth, and Reynolds begrudgingly playing the character despite this, because when was Deadpool ever going to get his own movie? But then of course that happened, and the Deadpool films have long made that a source of their own mockery, including the absolutely hysterical post-credit scene to the second film, but also just a running string of Hugh Jackman jokes, including mocking the ending to Logan again in the second film, which makes up the basis of that film's opening title sequence. So really you can say the groundwork for having Wolverine show up in a Deadpool movie has pretty much been laid since about 2009 or so. It almost feels like it was inevitable in many ways, even though actually Hugh Jackman deciding to reprise his role wasn't actually a given. It was a fairly recent thing. Believe it or not, it's been 6 years since Deadpool 2, and suffice to say, a lot has happened in that time, by which I mean the Disney buyout of Fox and all of their Marvel properties, including the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, which are now gradually being absorbed into the MCU, including Deadpool himself. And so there was some question as to whether putting Deadpool into the MCU would in some way new to him or change him, but the fact that the entire movie is a meta-commentary on this corporate merger pretty much says the opposite. One big noticeable change in this outing is the director. Stepping into the chair this time is Shawn Levy, who is Ryan Reynolds' regular collaborator, previously worked with him on Free Guy and The Adam Project. He also did the Night of the Museum movies. That is definitely different to the previous Deadpool directors, Tim Miller and David Leitch, who both came from stunt and action backgrounds. That was clearly where they were focusing upon, whereas Shawn Levy is definitely someone that focuses much more on comedy. That is where his experience lays. The movie is already breaking box office records as I record this review because it's the combination we've always wanted to see. We've wanted to see Deadpool playing off of Wolverine in the same movie, a proper version of Deadpool, I mean. Seeing Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman in the same space feels like an event. And so the question with a movie like Deadpool and Wolverine becomes, what exactly do you want to take from it? Do you come into a movie like this wanting cameos and fan service? I'm going to tell you right up at the top, you're going to be extremely happy with the movie if that's the case. But if you wanted something maybe a little bit more than that, if you wanted a good story to go along with it, maybe not so much. I'd argue the first Deadpool film was quite subversive, as much as a studio comic book film can be. After all, it was willed into existence by a league. It was the scrappy underdog that very nearly didn't happen. And the fact that there was a comic book movie that was very self-aware about the tropes, that it was poking fun at them, it did feel genuinely refreshing. There was kind of an anarchic feeling to the movie that felt like a poke in the eye to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which can get a bit self-serious at time, certainly it felt like something that we hadn't really seen before, especially because it was such a hard R movie. There were, of course, R-rated comic book movies before that, but they were quite rare, whereas I think there's a lot of movies that have followed in the shadow of Deadpool. Deadpool opened up things like The Suicide Squad, the James Gunn movie, and things like that. Deadpool 2 was a bigger, louder, and messier sequel, and everyone was kind of rushing in to do their cameos, and some of them were quite amusing, some of them were fun, but it definitely felt like it lost something because it wasn't the underdog anymore. It was a big, successful franchise, and that is only solidified by the time that Deadpool and Wolverine rolls around, where it's now fully fledged into the MCU. The first thing we see in the movie is the Marvel Studios logo, and yeah, Deadpool is humming along to the theme song over it, but it does feel very much like we're in standard Marvel territory to a certain extent. It's not the scrappy underdog, it's very much got a seat at the table now. And don't get me wrong, this is very much a hard R-rated Deadpool movie with all that entails. It doesn't feel satirized or watered down in that particular way, but it is also a Deadpool movie where there's a scene where he's led into a room showing screens that have clips of the Avengers movies, and it's all very celebratory and reverential, and the theme is playing. It plays that stuff surprisingly straight. Yeah, you get the jokes about, oh, you can't do that in a Disney movie. Kevin Feige won't allow us to do this in a Marvel film. But it feels weirdly toothless in its own way. Like, Kevin Feige probably had to approve the jokes about himself that Deadpool says in this movie, and that takes away from the real sting of it. The film doesn't really poke too much at the bear of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think it's also telling that Deadpool and Wolverine largely exists in its own sandbox. Yeah, it does have connections with things like Loki, but it plays largely as a self-contained movie, which makes sense because it feels in keeping with the other two entries, but it's also telling that they didn't really try to connect it with the massive behemoth of the MCU, and they aren't trying to do things that might affect what's going on in that universe. And so in that way, it does feel like, to a certain extent, there is a bit of satirization, but maybe that's just naturally so because it's been absorbed into the thing that it was commenting on in the first place, and actually feels surprisingly on brand despite the bloodletting. One of the more telling differences between this new Deadpool movie and the first two films is that the title sequence at the beginning of the movie is actually genuinely a credit sequence. In the first two films, it was gag credits. They were making fun of themselves. It added to the meta element of the entire movie, whereas this time, they just play the credits, which weirdly detracts because there's a fantastic bit of comedy going on underneath it, and so gag credits would have felt appropriate there, and it does detract a bit that it's literally just straight up opening billing. I guess you really can't do that in a Marvel film. So instead of playing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the film instead plays in the remnants of the Fox, Marvel and X-Men films, with the Void itself being a massive running joke at the expense of this and the corporate merger, with the most telling identifiable feature in this desert landscape being the fragments of the old 20th Century Fox logo, and it's envisioned as being this Mad Max style wasteland with characters roaming around the landscape on their cars. They even managed to fit in a joke at the expense of Furiosa, which seems like it might have been inserted in at roughly around the last minute once they realised that Furiosa was underperforming at the box office. Bit of a low blow there. And if the film is playing into the nostalgia for the Fox X-Men films, bringing back characters like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, then it helps that Jackman clearly hasn't missed a step in reprising the role. He's fantastic, as he's always been in his career-defining part. It's great to see him back again, and it's also great to finally see him at last in the comic book accurate costume, which is something that fans of the comic books have been asking for decades, because notoriously the X-Men films refused to have comic book accurate costumes, instead going for black leather ensembles because they felt that comic book accurate costumes would be a bit too campy. It definitely shows the difference between then and now that we finally get this at last, and actually it does look pretty good on Hugh Jackman. But the fact the costume is probably the most significant part of the role this time around is maybe a little bit revealing, in that Jackman has been now playing the role for 25 years, and I suddenly have the crushing realization of the weight of time on my mind by saying those words. But he has genuinely been playing this character for so long and in so many films now that there is literally nothing that he hasn't already done with the character at some point, one way or another. And you do feel that at points in Deadpool and Wolverine. Even though this is a different version of Logan, nominally speaking, it's still the same version of the character we're familiar with. And also, the fact that this version is dealing with survivor's guilt, dealing with the fact that he's lost the X-Men in his particular universe, wasn't that exactly what the character's main conflict was in Logan previously? It's just him retreading that to a certain extent. Maybe he kind of left the role for a reason the first time. And while I could definitely argue that the existence of Deadpool and Wolverine does undermine the power and significance of Logan, at least in terms of being a send-off for Jackman as the character, the film knowingly exploits that in its deliberately offensive opening sequence, which is probably the funniest part of the film and the best action set piece. It's a good example of what Deadpool can do right in its best moments, in that literal defilement actually turns out to be somewhat hysterical because it goes way beyond what you expect it to. And when Jackman does show up, he's largely playing it straight, which is exactly what you want, because he's meant to be the foil to Deadpool. You don't want both of them cracking wise. But as a buddy comedy, I do have to admit that after a while, I did find Deadpool and Wolverine's interactions to be a bit repetitive and a bit samey, because Logan's not exactly a big talker. He's a quite surly monosyllabic guy. Much of the interactions between Deadpool and Wolverine can largely be summed up as, "Oh, I'm Deadpool, I'm making a lot of quips," and then Wolverine just growls at him, "Shut the fuck up." More effective in terms of their squabbling are the fight sequences between Deadpool and Wolverine, of which there are 2 in the movie, and that's arguably one too many, but still, these sequences are bloody slapstick because both characters have healing abilities, so they can do the worst possible things to each other, and they just regenerate instantly with no consequences to do even more carnage on top of each other. And the fight scene in the car is a great example of this, especially as Deadpool is getting by far the worst of this in close quarters, where he's getting his limbs snapped out constantly, and then his limbs just heal back instantly. It's quite funny and knowingly over the top. But again, they do this twice when really they should have just had one big blowout like the one in the car, rather than doing 2 and diminishing the second one by having already done that beat. And as for Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool shtick, I think we're all familiar with it by this point. We know exactly what he's going to do in this movie, in that he's going to crank the sardonic quips up to 11, which is exactly in keeping with the character, and it's ultimately quite funny because of the sheer volume of the jokes, to just being very annoying depending on the scene. And I do have to admit, I was kind of sympathising with some of the characters, especially Logan, for finding him immensely irritating at points. Admittedly, I have form for this, as many long-time viewers will know. I can find that Ryan's shtick, when he really decides to go with it, can be a bit on the grating side, to say the least. He can be charming when he kind of dials it back down, but that's not the case in the Deadpool movies, and I will admit he's funny, but sometimes I grow very tired of it after a certain point, especially because Reynolds seems to be trying to set a world record for the amount of pegging jokes in a single film. But as I said before, the film delivers as a fan service machine. It gives the fans a lot of things that they've been wanting to see in a film for years. Deadpool and Wolverine is basically a testament to, hey, Disney owns all of these characters now, we can do this, we can do that. And that means that there is a veritable ocean of cameos, many of which are quite surprising, and many are fun in their own ways. And the surprise is absolutely the best part, so I'm not going to reveal any of them here, even though the movie has been out for over a week now. But still, watching the movie, it was quite enjoyable to have someone walk on screen and go, I genuinely didn't expect them to be in this movie, followed immediately by, Okay, I genuinely did not expect that person to show up. They are the last person I expected to appear in a Deadpool movie, but it's kind of sweet that they're here. And this is all very inside baseball, because it's not just playing on the knowledge of the X-Men films as the audience have very likely seen them, it's also playing on the development history of those films as well. At least one of these characters is a reference to a film that wasn't even made. This is very much meant to be a tribute to the Fox era of superhero films, as much as it's poking fun at it. It's arguably the forerunner to what we know the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it today, even as it ran concurrently with it for quite a few years. You could argue that we wouldn't have the MCU without these movies, proving that there was an audience for comic book films. It's the era that I grew up with. In my teens, I saw all these movies as they came out. I am the target audience for something like Deadpool and Wolverine, and the film even plays upon those emotions, because in the closing credits there's a tribute video where they've compiled clips from various X-Men films and other Fox Marvel properties and compiled it together, and there is a certain sweetness about that video, but I also thought there's a degree of rose-tinted glasses and rewriting history to a certain extent, because let's be absolutely real here, a lot of these films were lambasted by the fans when they came out, and they're still arguably some of the worst comic book movies that were made. Yeah, some of them were really good, and some of them were also wildly awful. It includes, in that tribute video, for example, footage from X-Men Origins Wolverine, which, yeah, you wouldn't have Deadpool and Wolverine without that movie. But it's also a pretty terrible film. Likewise, it also includes footage from the 2015 Fantastic Four, which is a very weird choice because that film had a notorious production history, and yet they include a couple of clips like, oh, it was just happy days on working on that particular movie, and that's not even getting into the fact the film completely sidesteps, say, the darker parts of those films, but in particular the X-Men films, like, say, Bryan Singer or Brett Ratner. You definitely won't hear those words coming out of Deadpool's mouth, let alone seeing any footage of them in the behind-the-scenes tribute video, which I'd imagine was very carefully edited to avoid any of that particular stuff. I'm the kind of person that lurked on, say, Superhero Hype or the IMDb message board, so I get a lot of this stuff, and there's a certain charm at looking back on these films compared to what we know the MCU as, because they are primitive in certain ways. But this is also romanticism through and through. And it's also not the first time the MCU has used the multiverse for nostalgia. You think of things like No Way Home, or even the middle act of Multiverse of Madness with all the cameos that popped up in the midst of that. And I'd argue that something like No Way Home did this better and actually earned it, because it did do something interesting with those characters, especially those from the Amazing Spider-Man films, which didn't have a resolution. It did actually finally give them an ending. This movie tries to do the same thing. It tries to talk about endings and things like that, but it feels a bit hollow because a lot of what it's referencing wasn't as beloved as the Spider-Man film, so it feels a bit strange, and also because the movie kind of discards that angle anyway, especially because it's flying in the face of an ending. It makes a joke about the fact that, yeah, Disney brought back Hugh Jackman, he's going to be playing the role till he's 90. And it kind of feels like it's true. But moreover, it reinforces the feeling that who shows up and what cameos there are have now become more important than the actual storytelling themselves in the MCU, which ever since Endgame has constantly gone back to previous characters, going back to previous movies, or even previous incarnations of franchises. And yes, I'm human. I enjoy the dopamine hit of recognizing a character, pointing at the screen like Leonardo DiCaprio, but even still, it doesn't disguise for me the fact that underneath it all, when you put all of that aside, there really isn't that much story here. I did like some of the new characters that were added for this movie, but again, they kind of get a bit lost amongst the huge ensemble that eventually builds up over the course of the movie. Emma Corrin, for example, is clearly doing their best as Cassandra Nova, who is the twin sister of Charles Xavier, but of course, the evil side. I really like, in particular, the visual of Cassandra poking their fingers inside characters' heads, and you can see their fingers kind of poking out through them. You can feel the discomfort of the characters. It's very visceral in its own way, and you can clearly tell that Corrin is trying to add a bit of dimension to what on the page is a very straightforward villain that is clearly dealing with their own jealousy at being erased. The problem is the actual narrative of the story means that Cassandra gets turned into a villain whose plans don't really make a whole bunch of sense. They just exist to drive the nominal plot forward. Likewise, Matthew McFadden is wonderfully slimy as Mr. Paradox, which is clearly playing on his work in Succession, and McFadden does his best to turn that into a real character, because on the page, he has to deliver absolute buckets of exposition. He has so much dialogue and so many speeches, absolute reams of plot. The problem I found is that McFadden, he's set up great, but then he disappears for far too much of the middle of the film, and by the time he does reappear, his role has been superseded by Corrin anyway, so he's again just largely standing around to deliver even more exposition. But if you want to know who the real cameos are in Deadpool and Wolverine, it's the returning players from the previous Deadpool films, who are barely even in the movie and extremely underutilized. Deadpool and Wolverine might be the first film in history where the cameos have more screen time than most of the main cast in the opening credits. Morena Baccarin might not be Fridge this time around as Vanessa, but she might as well effectively be, because this time around Vanessa has moved on, and that provides a bit of conflict for Deadpool as a character. But again, it's a similar conflict to what he was going through in the previous movie, in that he has to find a way of moving on without her. And honestly, that conflict doesn't entirely ring true, because he literally reversed time to bring her back to life. I think he might be a little bit of a keeper after something like that, but maybe that's just me. The only one that seems to actually evade this is Rob Delaney's Peter, who once again is a wholesome delight, even while he's doing jokes about weird piercings. But even so, I do think that the Deadpool cast are really squandered in this film, and especially because the conflict in this one is that Deadpool is trying to save his world. He's talking about how these characters, they are his world, but again, that rings rather false when they're hardly even in the movie to begin with, separating him from his core cast of characters, the characters that he plays off of, I feel like is one of the film's worst decisions. And while we're on the subject of the film's emotional art, the film tries to have a bit of depth with Wade trying to find his place, trying to find his significance. This whole thing about him wanting to be part of the Avengers, isn't that just very similar to what he was doing in the second Deadpool film, where he wanted a place on the X-Men and he created X-Force? He wants to feel part of a team and feel included. He feels like that is going to make him feel important. So again, we're kind of going through things that we've already done in a Deadpool movie, but also because this gets overwhelmed in the sheer amount of cameos and stuff slathered on top of it, the movie tries to go for a big emotional moment that feels totally unearned at the end of it. And you might say, well, so what? But the first two Deadpool films did have that, because you need that emotional grounding for the character. Otherwise, he's just bouncing around doing quips and he's just completely empty. The point is, he does actually care about something, because you need the audience to care about something. But Deadpool and Wolverine doesn't pull this trick off. And because the film is missing that, it feels like it quickly falls into a cycle that it repeats over and over again. Deadpool and Wolverine bicker and fight, then a cameo walks in from behind, then you pause for a reveal and applause, then you have a set piece, and then just repeat over and over again until about 2 hours passes. When it comes to action, I don't think it matches the first two films. For a start, too much of the film takes place in nondescript locations like empty deserts, woodlands, or fields. So many just generic locations, although really if it wanted to be a tribute to the Fox Marvel films, it needed to set at least 50% of the movie in corridors. And when it comes to the action set pieces, they're really messy and visually cluttered. There's too many effects getting in the way. Yeah, it affords the time for the guest players to do their cool moments. Those are photographed quite well, but they're cut in very awkwardly. The staging is clumsy. It's always kind of cutting back and forth in ways that don't really feel very organic. Much later on, near the end of the movie, there's an attempt at a corridor sequence. You know, those kind of sequences that are inspired by the famous bit in Old Boy, where the characters have to go up against an army of opponents in a single continuous shot. This is something that you've seen in a lot of the Marvel TV shows. Really, in this case, it's a street scene, but still, it's an example of this. It again feels like a sequence that exists simply because it looks cool, and it ultimately comes across as just being empty time wasting for yet more cameos. There's no real significance to it. They just spend 5 minutes on all of this stuff, and it has nothing to do with the story or the plot. It just stops to do all this stuff and then gets back to the climax of the movie. Although I suppose when you think about it, Shawn Levy might actually be the best person to direct this, because it really isn't all that different from Free Guy, where Reynolds had to save his world from being destroyed amidst a sea of cameos and references. It's just that this time around, there's more people saying motherfuckers and exploding heads. Look, Deadpool and Wolverine knows exactly who it's playing towards, and I think those people will be happy. In fact, I know a lot of those people are happy. I've seen people talking about how much they enjoyed the movie and how they had fun with it, which is exactly what you want from a cinema experience. I'm glad for those people. I want to be one of those people. I don't want to be sitting here going, well, I didn't like it as much because there wasn't much of a story to it. But it's also the weakest Deadpool film for me because it wore thin very quickly once I realised what exactly it was. Maybe it's just me, but I'm tired of all the IP displays that we've seen recently, especially in the superhero genre, and not just in Marvel. I mean, we've seen it in things like The Flash, which was roundly rejected, but largely is doing a lot of the same things. It's trying to cash in on the affection for the past and the movies that we grew up with, especially my generation. But I need more than that when I go to a movie. There's also a part of me that wonders that once the hype dies down and people start rewatching the movie, once they've got past those initial surprises, on a second or third viewing, the lack of substance aside from those things might start to leap out at those viewers, and that's a bit of a shame. It feels like Deadpool and Wolverine might be a kind of movie that you watch once, you enjoy it, but you don't come back to. For something that starts out as poking the genre in the eye Three Stooges style, Deadpool and Wolverine ultimately feels like more the same old when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, just navel-gazing at its past. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can insert Metaquip here at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.